So, welcome everybody to this, our return from summer holidays for Speak Up talk for autumn 2024. And in a minute, I'll be introducing our speaker, Seb de Menthon. But before that, I just want to say at Speak Up, what we're trying to do is give people like Sebastian, like a number of people who are doing a job that is really contributing to changing the dial on the climate and the ecodiversity crises, and give them a platform so we can all find out what they're doing and perhaps what we can do to support them. So with that in mind, tonight we're looking at Client Earth, and I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But our next talk is Paul Eastwood, and he's going to talk about home decarbonisation, particularly his whole experience of choosing, installing and using a heat pump so that he can get rid of the gas in his terraced Victorian house. So that's going to be quite an interesting story in October. For those of you who don't know our process here, we are recording this talk, so if you don't want to appear in the video in the recording, please put your video off now. And our speaker will speak for the first 20 minutes. We ask you not to interrupt if possible, but to put your questions on the chat. And our speaker will speak for about 20-25 minutes, and then there's lots of chance to ask him questions. Please put them in the chat, as it's usually the most efficient way that we can feed the questions to the speaker, and it just allows us to group things together. So if you could comply with that, we'd really appreciate it. If you've got a big question on anything, please also ask the big question if there's a speak up question or anything like that. And one last thing I'd like to make a plea for, if you've got any ideas for speakers, particularly in the world of food and eating, the speakers of people who can help us think about how we reduce the carbon and biodiversity issues around our food, we would really welcome it. Thank you for that little bit, because we're looking for speakers in that area. So, to turn to tonight's meeting, I am absolutely delighted to have with us someone from Client Earth. I started hearing about Client Earth through LinkedIn, where they do an excellent job putting up a pitch. And I suddenly realized what a fantastic job they do. And once I saw the name Client Earth, they kept appearing in the news. I heard them on the radio, etc. And suddenly I was aware of, wow, this is a company and an organization that's doing an awful lot of things at a big scale. So Client Earth uses the power of law to bring about systemic change to protect the Earth and its inhabitants. I'm sure Seb, our speaker, is going to tell you a lot more about them, but let me tell you about him. He was studying environmental law at the London School of Economics when he first heard about Client Earth. And he thought, wow, there's an organisation that specialises in taking legal action and holds big governments, big corporations to account for the harm they're doing to the planet. And he's now 2 years into his career with Client Earth's development team. And he says he's more invested than ever in the potential for legal change to push societal change towards positive tipping points. Positive tipping points is definitely something we need a lot of in the next decade. This is the most important decade probably in the change. So you're going to hear about landmark legal actions, David versus Goliath cases, but also some of their decade-long legal advocacy programs, the programs they're doing behind the scenes we don't hear about on the news. So with that, I would like to hand over, if I may, to Sebastian. Seb.
Hi, thank you for that introduction. That was interesting to hear from your perspective, and yeah, bang on. So thank you very much, and thank you everyone else for joining as well. Okay, I can see myself in big. I'll try and share my screen. So let's have a look. Can you see that okay? Thumbs up, yeah?
That's it.
Perfect. Nice one. Yeah, so thank you all for joining. It's great intention of positive action for the planet to give up your evening to learn more about what we can all do. So thank you for that. Client Earth is an environmental legal NGO. It's been going for about 17 years, and you can think of it a bit like a law firm, but instead of the normal structure of a law firm where you'd have someone come through the door with a problem asking for a lawyer to help. Instead, there's a bunch of lawyers and they sit around and they think, okay, the earth is our client. And what can we do to bring cases on behalf of the earth, which most of the time can't come through the door and tell us what to do. But we can look at the situation in the world and find cases, legal advocacy, where hopefully we can have a massive impact on system change. So one of the questions is, why the law? And I'm going to try and play a quick video for you. I'll just go back to the presentation. So hopefully that gave you a bit of an idea why we choose the law as our tool to try and change the future. But to just expand on that as well, I think some of the main reasons that some of them were mentioned there, kind of with the law, you can hold big governments, big corporations to account, as Rosie said. You can also compel action. So in a situation where a government isn't doing what they say they're going to do, there's often courts. Oh, I think YouTube started playing other things now. Apologies. You can compel action with the law. You can change the rules of the game by introducing new laws. And you can also use high leverage potential. And what I mean by that is that generally, if as an individual you're trying to change what a government or a corporation's doing, it's very difficult to do that just with your voice. But with a few lawyers and a bit of funding and a well-placed case, there's a huge leverage of impact with what the law can do. Let's move on. So here you've probably seen we're using the power of the law to create a healthy planet where people and nature can thrive together. And part of the idea of using the law is also about the fact that we already have lots of the solutions we need. Technologically, we already have the clean energy potential, and we have ways of transporting people around that are much more sustainable. And we have ways of enjoying ourselves that are much less reliant on consumerism and fossil fuels. So we have lots of the tools that we need to create the future that we all want to live in. The problem is getting from where we are to that world. And there's lots of speed bumps along the way, and there's lots of inertia from a system that's been set in its ways for a very long time. So one of the ways you can break up that inertia and make the change is by using the law. The problem is on a huge scale, obviously. It's a global problem, and we really need to transform all the major systems that we have in the world, the human-created systems, which is a massive job, but we have seen really exciting progress so far when we've been using the law, and I'll talk about some of those examples. So we use what we call the whole life cycle, which means that we don't just take on individual cases, strategic litigation, we also strengthen the law, advocate for the right legislation and policy positions, and draft laws for governments. So a really exciting example of that has just come into play this year. It's been almost a decade in the making. Client Earth's been involved at every step of the way, helping to draft this legislation and then advocating for it. And it's at the EU level. So we do a lot of work at the EU level because it's what they call a regulatory superpower, which means that not only does the EU's laws have an impact on every country in the EU, which is obliged to comply with them, but also as the biggest single economic bloc in the world, the EU has power to influence the rest of the world that does trade with the EU, for example, because we will require them to be compliant with our regulations. So we really focus on what we can change at the EU level to strengthen the law. And a major win this year was in the realm of deforestation. Deforestation, as I'm sure you all know, is a huge problem. Forests are one of the main lungs of the planet. They provide just under a third of the oxygen we breathe. The ocean provides another third. And the rate at which the forests are being chopped down, often for commodities that we consume in Europe, is such that we're looking at negative tipping points in the Amazon within a decade. And if we lose the Amazon and we lose other major forests, it's going to spiral into a problem of more extreme weather and serious biodiversity loss that will have a massive impact locally on the people that depend on those forests, but also globally in terms of our whole atmosphere. So we've really been looking at an intervention, a way we can strengthen the law that will protect the global forests that we all depend on. And this EU deforestation regulation, which came into force this year, is going to play a really significant role in protecting the world's forests. Because what this regulation does, and as I said, we helped to draft this regulation, and then we advocated for its implementation. But what this regulation does is it puts a requirement on importers of goods from outside of Europe. So if you're any importer importing, say, beef or soy products or palm oil or any of those big forest risk commodities, so commodities that are often linked to deforestation abroad, you have to do due diligence if you're one of those companies. And you have to ensure that those products aren't causing deforestation in the countries where they're from. And that process is what that process looks like in practice is now having to be kind of created by the EU with our input, and then that's going to have to be enforced. So it's not into effect immediately. We need to make sure that with a huge change like this, that it's done in a way that doesn't immediately impact local communities negatively, because there's a risk that local communities all around the world that are engaged in these economic activities in the forest will suffer as a result of a law like that. So we need to be really careful about the environmental justice aspect, but we pay close attention to that by working with partners. But what this EU deforestation regulation is going to do is going to be completely revolutionary across all of the forest risk commodities that we're importing into Europe. And you can imagine the scale at which we're importing beef or soy or any of those products. And without proper due diligence, which is the situation now, then our consuming habits, what we buy and what we eat, is having a massive effect on the forests and the people that are living in them. But with this new due diligence in place, we're going to know for sure that the products we're consuming aren't causing harms to those forests that we really need. So that's a really, really exciting one. As I said, we helped to draft that. And then at the end, just before it was going to be decided on in the European Parliament, we did a huge effort of advocacy where we managed to gather the voices of thousands of citizens, hundreds of thousands of citizens across Europe, as well as quite a star-studded list of celebrities that put their name to a letter to put pressure on the EU to adopt this. we also collaborated on a film to kind of get the hearts and minds of the European decision makers in place before. So we really look at how we can get laws in place, not just by working on them, but how we can facilitate a kind of cultural environment where a law will be accepted and put in place. And then in the next stage of the life cycle of the law, there is strategic litigation, which is probably what most people hear about if they hear about Klein Earth. It's those David versus Goliath cases that Rosie mentioned. They're the ones that will get into the news because it's kind of small NGO with a small team of underfunded lawyers takes on BP or takes on Shell's board of directors. So that's the kind of stuff that hits the headlines. But from this year alone, we've had multiple wins that are really exciting on the litigation front. But for our audience here, I think it's probably apt to mention our win against the UK government. At the moment, the UK government is legally obliged by its own 2008 Climate Act. You don't need to remember any of this, but by its own Climate Act to create a proper plan to get to net zero by 2050. It's really positive that we have that piece of law in the first place. That's quite progressive in terms of even Western governments. But a law like that sounds great on paper, is utterly useless if it's not put into practice. So we're fortunate that we have the legal tools as Klein Earth to look at that situation, to look at the plan that the UK government currently has to get to net zero by 2050, to do a full analysis on whether it adds up in terms of the numbers, and then to build a case to the UK government to show that it doesn't add up. And it's a breach of their legal obligation to have a plan that's not going to get the UK government and the UK in general, the whole of the UK, to net zero by 2050. So we took that case in collaboration with the Good Law Project, which are a good partner of ours, and also Friends of the Earth. And our main argument really was that in your plan, talking to the UK government, your plan relies on technology that doesn't exist yet. And I don't know about any of you, but I think if any of us were to make a plan, we'd probably rely on things that we reasonably think exist now, because that's how you know that you can fulfill a plan. But relying on technology such as carbon capture and storage that has no proof at scale yet is, we thought, not viable as a proper plan. And fortunately, the courts had more sense than the government in this case, and they agreed with us. And they have ordered the UK government to take proper action, and they've given them 1 year to redo the plan, to come back next year with a proper plan, which will assess again and hopefully not have to take them to court. Because I've told this whole tale, I could have actually told you the same story last year, because we beat them in court for the same purpose last year. But when the court ordered them to redo a plan and we analysed it, it was just as bad as before, if not worse. So we've taken them to court a second time. And now it's up to the Labour government to build a new plan. And we have hope with the current cabinet that actually they'll take that job more seriously than the previous government did. And we'll have, by this time next year, a proper plan that will get the UK government on track, the UK as a whole on track. And that might sound potentially, on the whole scale of things, like quite minor, considering the UK's contribution to global emissions is a very small percentage. But as it's historically been the UK through the Industrial Revolution and our example of industrialization that's emitted a huge portion, it's actually our duty to be leaders in this space now. And if there's no kind of first movers on this in the global stage, then no one's going to follow. So it's really important that we have even countries that aren't having a huge impact now taking these steps to lead the way for others. So I'm really excited about that. Then that's against a government, against a corporation. We've had another exciting win this year against Dutch airline KLM. Dutch airline KLM had been doing a really great job of advertising themselves in a way that made people think that it wasn't harmful to the environment to fly. They had a Fly Responsibly campaign, and they talked all about their net zero plans publicly, similar to the UK government. But it was really this image that they were portraying about flying being completely compatible with a positive and safe future for us all to live in. Fortunately, there are quite good laws in place to protect consumers from what is essentially misinformation. And we took a case in Amsterdam saying that this was a breach of consumer protection law for KLM to be misrepresenting their plans and essentially to be falsely saying that they were on track to be net zero by 2050 as well. And what was really exciting is in that case, the court agreed with us, and KLM had to withdraw their greenwashing advertising. But what Client Earth really tries to do, and this is a good example of it, is find a case that's not going to have just an impact in that one instance, but that's going to have a ripple effect across a whole system. So the aviation system is something that needs massive change, and doing case by case against every airline that's causing harm is going to take too long, longer than we have. But what's really exciting is that this case has inspired the EU to investigate 20 other airlines themselves simultaneously. We would never have the resource to do that ourselves. But if we can put in a case that makes a really clear argument, then we can have regulatory bodies like the EU taking it upon themselves to ensure that that kind of greenwashing isn't happening, which will ultimately reduce people's desire to fly if they realize the full impact that it has, which we hope will have a significant impact as well. Those are a couple of examples from strategic litigation and capacity building. So capacity building is a really exciting field for us because, like I just said, we don't have the resources to take on every government and every corporation ourselves that's causing harm. But if we can train other people to do that, then we can have a much bigger impact. So we're focusing so far on the Philippines. We have a really exciting program there where we have 30 law schools, clinics in law schools that so far have trained 330 students. Well, these are last year's numbers, actually. I don't know what the numbers are now, but they'll be higher. At least 330 students. And those 330 students have gone on to train 800 law enforcement officers in the Philippines. And between those 800 law enforcement officers, there's been a huge amount of impact. But just one example is that some of them got together with some of these students and banded together with other NGOs, and they managed to stop a gas plant from being built. And that was a 600 megawatt project that would have been emitting for 30 years to come. So it's very difficult to measure the impact of the work that we do because it spreads out so far around the world and across so many different people. But when we hear stories like that, it feels like we're definitely on the right track with capacity building and putting in cases that can really lead the way for others to follow. Another example of capacity building is China. And China's been in the news a lot more recently for kind of turning things around in terms of their environmental progress. It was 10 years ago that everyone was saying, what's the point in doing any personal changes to our lifestyle? What's the point in trying to reduce our carbon footprint in a country like the UK when China is having such an enormous impact and just belching out fossil fuels constantly at scales that we can't imagine? And fortunately, that situation is now shifting quite rapidly. They are a country that is investing more than any other in the green transition. They've beat their targets every year on renewables, and Client Earth likes to think that we've played quite a role in that transition. China actually saw the work that we were doing in Europe, and we got an invitation from them to go over there. And the first thing they asked us to do was help them to draft a law that would allow citizens in China to sue corporations that were harming the environment. And then we did that quite successfully. They were happy with our collaboration. We built good relationships there. The next thing that happened is that we got invited by the Supreme Court in China to train prosecutors in taking those environmental cases that they now had the legislation to do. And it's been thrilling to see the scale at which that training has had an impact. There's been about 100,000 cases every year judged by those, taken on by those prosecutors that we help train. And the influence that that's had as well with our advice on changing kind of their investments in coal overseas and other things, we feel like it's been pretty significant in helping them to change around their environmental ambition, which is really exciting as well as they'll be leading the way. That's not to say that China doesn't have lots of other problems, but we're we're focusing on the environmental issues for now, I suppose. And yeah, here it kind of gives a bit of an idea of the different areas that we're working in. It would take probably the rest of the week to tell you the story of every case and advocacy project that we've got going on right now. And I can't even touch on all of the areas, but this gives kind of an overall sense of the scale that we're working at. Like I mentioned before, we're changing and introducing new laws. That's kind of under robust legal systems and rule of law. Purposeful financial and economic systems. I'll tell you another example of that, but we have a whole team of lawyers looking at how we can encourage pension funds, banks to become more ambitious. Regenerative food systems, ocean and land use. That's obviously a huge system, kind of many systems there bunched into one. But the food system, as I'm sure you know, is responsible for about 30% of the emissions that we're looking at, as well as huge biodiversity issues in terms of intensive agriculture and the effect that has on soils. And there's already a lot of exciting technology that can help to transform that and actually have farming as a way of regenerating the soil and regenerating nature. And we're doing a huge amount of work to advocate at the EU level for policies that will help that. But we're also doing kind of individual cases as well, against pollution, for example, in the UK, to protect the UK's rivers from pollution, and elsewhere. And finally, clean and sustainable transport, energy, and material systems. So again, a huge amount there bunched into one. But traditionally, we started off looking at energy systems, and now we're taking seriously as well materials like plastic and the effect that they have. We have cases pending against Coca-Cola and Danone, serious actions to try and change the way that plastics are produced and actually stop them from suggesting that recycling is the simple solution. Because when we look at the numbers, recycling over the last 50 years has only actually taken 9% of the plastics out of the system and reused them. So far in its current state, recycling is not a proper solution, and we need to actually look at the plastic production at its source. So that's really exciting. Here we have, this is meant to demonstrate kind of the power of leverage. So back in 2019, we were doing a lot of work all through the 2010s, we were doing a lot of work in Poland to try and stop Poland from relying so heavily on coal. You might know that coal is the most polluting fossil fuel, and we try and base our actions on what scientists tell us is kind of the biggest impact. So when we first started, we were asking scientists, if we can do one thing, what would it be? And they said, well, we need to stop the next generation of coal-fired power stations from being built, because it's one thing having the ones in place already, but if we build new ones that are going to be operational for decades to come, then there's really no chance of limiting warming to temperatures that are really livable or sustainable for the way that we live. So we took that very seriously, and then we looked around Europe and we saw that Poland was the biggest reliant country on coal. So we started an office there, and really at the beginning it was all about challenging coal plants. And it turned out for a long time it was very easy, because they weren't following the laws when they were building these coal plants and trying to get permits for them. They just simply weren't doing the proper process to get a permit, which is just a simple environmental impact assessment, looking at the impact that's going to have for years to come. So we could reliably, coal plant after coal plant, say, where's your impact assessment, show that it's inadequate, and actually get licenses for these new coal plants removed, until we came up against a company called INEA. And in this situation, the government and the company really, really wanted this enormous gigawatt coal plant to be built. It was a 1.2 billion euro project. It would have been Poland's largest coal plant. And the impact assessment argument in this case wasn't flying. We tried it and it didn't work. So we had to think creatively. And I say we, I didn't work with the client at the time, I can't take any credit. But we had a fascinating young lawyer, Pete Barnett, who was looking at the problem and thinking, okay, well, if we can't use environmental laws like impact assessments, what could we use to get this coal plant stopped? And he realized that actually, if you look at this from a financial perspective, it's not a good investment. Building this coal plant now, because Poland is in the EU, and the EU is very quickly moving towards better regulations overall that are going to affect Poland on whether they can be emitting fossil fuels, kind of relying on fossil fuels to this extent. Actually, it's not a good investment. So we took 30 euros in shares in this company, INEA, and then we went to an independent financial auditor and we asked for a report on whether this 1.2 billion euro coal plant was going to be a good investment for INEA, whether as an investor it looks good for us in the future of INEA's business plan. And the report was very clear that actually this coal plant was likely to become a stranded asset within a few decades, and it wasn't going to be a good investment. So we took that to court as shareholders, saying we're interested in INEA being a good functioning business, and actually we have evidence here that this isn't a good plan. And the government listened to that, and they actually withdrew the permit that they'd given to INEA. And what we found really exciting is that the next day the share price for INEA actually jumped 5%. So it wasn't just the courts that realized that this wasn't a good idea. It was actually the economy as well, and that's it was quite exciting to see that actually the economy can be aligned to environmental interests. It's often not the case, but in this case, it was a nice bit of evidence that it definitely can be. So I've given you lots of specific examples here, but you probably haven't had a full sense of the scale of the work yet. And hopefully this slide here demonstrates some of that. Also, I realize I haven't timed myself. So if I'm way over already, you can stop me if it's time for questions.
Keep going. We're loving it, and you're answering the questions as you go. So just keep going.
Okay, great. Nice. So at the top here, you can see we've got 300 staff at the moment. That's built up pretty quickly over the last 17 years. Hopefully this has been a compelling story, but lots of people have found it a compelling story and they've decided to fund us. So we've been able to grow quite quickly. We have offices now in all of these locations where you can see dots. We started in London, and I can tell you the origin story if you've got time and people want to hear it, but that's at least 5 minutes in itself. So we started in London and then opened an office in Brussels so that we can have a big impact on EU laws as they're forming, and also be right there to hold them to account when they're not following their own laws. Got lots of cases like that at the moment, unfortunately. Berlin, Madrid opened quite recently. Beijing, I told you about the work we're doing there. In Tokyo, we just opened an office last year. We don't take litigation in Tokyo because it's not kind of the culture to do that there, but we work with shareholders to make the environmental argument and the economic argument, sorry, very similar to what I just described in Poland to big companies there. And we've seen quite exciting results so far. At every AGM season, we managed to kind of draw a few more significant commitments from major companies and on their ambition, which is exciting to see. Los Angeles, we recently opened in the US, and we've got 2 cases going there now. One about zombie oil wells, which is very exciting. I can tell you more about that if we've got time. And others on greenwashing. And at the top, you can see 200 partners. What I didn't focus on enough in the talk before is how important partnerships are for all the work that we do. And that's particularly true when we're operating in Africa, where we do a lot of capacity building there as well to equip forest communities with the legal tools they need to be able to fight for their own rights, either against governments or corporations. But we're very aware that it's not really appropriate for us to just arrive there and start doing cases ourselves. So we partner with other organizations and we help them with our legal expertise. And then it's usually those organizations that do trainings with local forest communities as well. So it's really supporting great organizations that are already doing good work there with the resources that we have, and the expertise. And yeah, 50 plus countries. So the dots are where we have offices, but 50 plus countries is the amount of places that we have litigation or advocacy projects going on. So it's really on a global scale, and 160 cases. What I should add to that is at least the same number of advocacy projects. Hopefully, from what I've described about the life cycle of the law, and kind of strengthening the law as well as doing litigation and as well as capacity building, is that it's not just about the cases. Sometimes we can have an even bigger effect by introducing a new law through advocacy, legal advocacy, or through capacity building, like you heard about in China and the Philippines. There's really more impact over time to be seen from those things than just direct litigation, though litigation is probably what we're best known for. So that should give you a decent overview of what we do. As I said, it would take an awfully long time to tell the stories of lots of the cases, but I barely touched on what we're doing to protect the ocean. That's a huge area of our work. Got many cases going on there, some against the EU, some against individual countries, sorry. And increasingly, we're going to be looking at companies as well. And clean air is a major area that we look at as well across the EU. We've got many cases going on representing individuals who've suffered as a result of lack of clean air, but also, if anyone remembers Dieselgate, we've got Dieselgate round 2 on right now, because the illegal defeat devices that were being used by cars back then are actually still in play now. There's 19 million vehicles still on the road in Europe with illegal defeat devices. So we've got complaints lodged with France, with the UK, with Germany, trying to kind of shed light on that and get those vehicles recalled so that the level of air pollution that we're all experiencing can go down at least a bit. I think right now, 90% of citizens in the EU are breathing polluted air according to World Health Organization standards, and that it's considered the biggest environmental health risk in Europe. And I mean, that's a tragedy at a human scale. But if we think about that from a health perspective and the cost that poor health has on Europe as well, it's really completely nonsensical to allow highly polluting vehicles on the road just for some corporate gain. And the final part of this, which is absolutely essential, is how can you help? It might seem, with all these huge cases and the EU and governments, etc., that kind of individual citizens don't have a role in all this. But what I always think is that the law doesn't happen in a vacuum. The law is kind of the way that we formulate the rules that we kind of want to reflect our culture. And the way that happens is that judges or decision makers ultimately have to sit down and look at the arguments we're putting forward and decide whether it's a yes or a no, or whether they're going to make a decision that's good for the future or not. And the cultural situation that they're in has a massive impact. So anything that people can do to directly support our cases with their voice, with telling people about it, with posting about it on social media, with following the work that we do and basically spreading the word, not only has an impact for potential funding for us so that we can keep doing the work, but it can really have an impact on how the cases get decided and whether the new laws get implemented. Because the people making those decisions, at least in most of the world, are operating in a democracy, and they know that to a certain extent they can only get away with ignoring those things if people aren't holding them to account as well. And if it's just a charity going to them and saying this is a big problem, then it's very easy to ignore us. But if it's a charity and the whole of the population, or a huge part of the population, also saying, yeah, this is really important, that's where we see really exciting, fast change at the scale we need. So everyone does have a role to play in using their voice to support the work that we're doing. But also, I would be lying if I said that we don't also need money. We're not a company, we're just a charity. And all of the work that we do is funded by philanthropists or grant making organizations, or actually just ordinary people that donate £10 a month, £3 a month, whatever they can afford. If you met one of the lawyers in the pub and would buy them a drink, then send us £5. That's the way we think about it, basically, because if everyone does that, then that's how we can really scale up and keep expanding. Because despite having 160 cases and the same amount of advocacy going on, I'm still not sure that if we just carry on at this level, that we're going to have a really livable future, let alone a future where people and planet are thriving together. We still have a big challenge ahead of us. We can definitely do it. Humans can change behavior very rapidly. As if we look throughout history, it's phenomenal how quickly we can actually change if we all put our minds to it. But it needs a collective energy, and you guys clearly have that energy by investing your time and working out what you can do. So spreading the word, and anyone that you think might be interested in either just hearing these stories or actually supporting financially as well, it really makes a difference to just gently make that case to them. I will stop sharing, but I can going to remove the spotlight as well. I can share our newsletter, which is a nice way of staying in touch. It does have quite a few donation asks in there, just as the nature of how we have to do fundraising. But if that's not for you, then you can just ignore those and focus on kind of the news that's coming through it. And I'll just put that in the chat as well.
Well, thank you very, very much, Seb. And I thought I knew a bit about you, and I know an awful lot more now. And I have to say, from my personal point of view, I'm inspired and in awe, because it is quite David and Goliath out there. And I love your client earth approach. And it seems to me that there aren't too many client earths out there, and there's quite a lot of governments and quite a lot of companies. So let's get on with the questions then. So there's been a couple of questions, which is who pays for the very important work. I suppose you've covered it a bit, but give us some idea of the scale, if you can, about the ask versus, you know, how big is the business of getting the funding?
Yeah, for sure. So if you compare us to like one of the big names, the household names like WWF or Greenpeace, for example, we are a tiny fraction of the size. They have many thousands of employees and budgets in the hundreds of millions across the world. We have a budget overall of about 30 million, but 25 million of that is provided by grant makers. And those grant makers are really looking for a specific bit of work. So they're supporting a case against the UK government, and they need to see the results on that, or they're supporting our work to challenge the overfishing in the EU. But what's really the most valuable to us is the unrestricted funding, where people give that to us and we can use it however we like. And what's important for us is that we can scope what legal actions are going to be the most impactful. And that involves quite a lot of research. It involves creative thinking. It involves creating strategies that are quite ambitious and that might fail, and that often, well, not often, but they can fail. And the failures can have kind of positive impacts in themselves in terms of creating engaging stories or pushing the window of possibility further open. But really having the freedom to think creatively and find how to innovate with the law is what makes Client Earth impactful. And the budget that we have for that is much smaller. That's less than 5 million. And at least 1 million of that is just coming from people donating at a very kind of minor weekly, monthly level. But without that 1 million, there's a whole range of scoping and creative thinking and kind of planning that can't happen, that's really critical to our functioning. So it sounds like very big, but then when you think about really what we have to work with to give us the freedom to be an organization that can have that kind of impact, it starts getting small very quick.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
I think
yeah,
everybody who's got any charity experience is nodding their head about those unrestricted funds being really very, very important.
yeah.
There's another couple of questions, I think, about how do you prioritize your work? And I think that goes with the question, how do you decide which cases or projects to take on and which to ignore?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a question that doesn't have a very simple answer, to be honest, because historically, we've, as I said, gone to the scientists and said, okay, what's the biggest thing we can do? And that's what we did at the beginning when there was just our founder, James, and a couple of other lawyers. We were like, all right, what can we do that's firstly going to make a splash? So that's not only going to have a big impact for people and planet, but that's also going to be a great story, because the reality of being an NGO is that you need great stories to be able to fundraise. So the very first thing that we did was clean air cases at the same time in the UK, Germany, and France, because James, our founder, figured that if he could take on 3 governments simultaneously out of nowhere, that would be a pretty good story. And he was right. And he did actually beat the UK government, and which has slowly been responding to that and improving air quality in the UK. But then, as I mentioned, beyond that, when it was a time of growth, we were looking at what's the biggest thing we can do for the planet as a whole. And the scientists said, stop coal. So we put a lot of our resources at the beginning into stopping coal. And then as we've been able to grow and take on wider environmental issues, so the food system, like I mentioned, the financial system, transport system, in each of those teams, they're kind of doing that same process. They're looking at research, they're speaking to scientists, but they're also using their legal expertise to analyze what laws there are in place at the moment and decide where a legal action might have a huge impact on the way that that whole system's operating. So it might be simple. It might be that for clean air, that there's just laws that are being broken. And if that's a low-hanging fruit for us, we can go after the enforcement of a law, and that's really clear cut. It might be that in trying to change the food system, it's just that there aren't good laws in the first place. And then it's not that we can take cases against anyone, because there's no framework for us to do that. And we have to take a step back and look at how we can advocate in legislation that might be coming down the downstream anyway, and make that stronger. And that's what we do at the EU level. Kind of, they have a program of legislation that's coming down the line, and we look at that and we think, okay, well, if we can forge relationships with these people now, and if we can demonstrate why this law needs to have these measures now, then we'll have something to enforce later, and we'll have a much better playing field to be operating in. So it's really case by case. And when we're thinking about kind of deforestation across the Amazon or across Africa, sometimes because there's not great enforcement potential there, we have to look, okay, where is there good enforcement potential in the EU? So we can use the EU deforestation regulation to have an impact over there, because actually it's not that they're just cutting down the forests over there for their own benefit. They're cutting down the forests because we're demanding goods. So we can find a way of changing EU law that's going to affect deforestation somewhere else. So
Yeah.
it's really case by case, but it's
Okay.
all about the evidence and about leverage. So what
Okay.
small thing can have a huge impact?
Okay, thank you very much for that. Now, there's a few questions about some specific bits. We have a question, which is one I've also was thinking. I'm interested in the UK government's failure to implement carbon zero construction through the planning system. Is that something Client Earth has considered or will consider?
It's a good question. I think it's the kind of thing that we would love to delve into if we had more capacity. But for reference, our UK legal team that did the UK environment case was 3 lawyers. Actually, one of them from a slightly different team pitted in to help. So it's really 2 lawyers looking at the UK, and they just don't have the capacity to delve into every kind of issue like that, even though that would have a big effect. So the case against the UK government's overall plan should have a trickle down effect on kind of how they're doing all those other planning systems. And we hope to see that, and maybe an enforcement case could come down the line if that was strategic. But yeah, at the moment we have to think kind of super big, and then drill down into the details if we get capacity.
There's another question along the same lines with the UK cases. Are you involved in any work to prevent Equinor and the UK government opening new oil and gas fields in the North Sea?
There is some advocacy work that we've done around that, and then we've been looking at with this change of government what we can do, but we haven't been prioritizing it because there's actually a lot of great work being done by other organizations in the UK already, and often it's useful to join forces, but often it's actually if that space is being filled already, we'll look somewhere else for where there isn't an untapped kind of potential, and think about that. And because there was no clear case with Equinor, and it was kind of just a situation of the government allowing the permits again and again. In a way, our case against the UK government's net zero strategy should have had an impact on that, but it didn't with the previous government. But as we're seeing, actually, there's quite positive potential for Equinor and North Sea drilling in general to be kind of reverted on by the new government.
Okay. Sarah, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump to one of your other questions, and then we'll come back to the clean air one. I was interested in this for the sake of a career. So if you're a young lawyer, is Client Earth seen to be good on your CV?
Depends what your goals are. I mean, to be a lawyer at Client Earth, you will have already done 10 years probably in a corporate law firm. And you will have been making a salary in kind of at least six figures, and you'll be top of your field, and then you'll be looking at your life and deciding, actually, this isn't as rewarding as I hoped it would be. Doing kind of mergers and acquisitions for big companies isn't the sweet flavor nectar that I was promised, or defending big corporations for violations against their employees. None of this sits right. So they actually often take an enormous pay cut to be with Client Earth. And it's probably not a career stepping stone for them. It's normally a kind of career destination that they've either been working towards or had a moment of enlightenment where they've decided that that's what they want to do. And they'll do it for 50 grand or 60 grand. Realistically, they're being paid an absolute fraction of the money that they'd be making elsewhere. Our founder and CEO, he was one of the best legal minds in the world at the time, and he could have easily been making £1 million in the US, $1 million or more, working in a major law firm. And yeah, he decided that what he really cared about was protecting nature. So he took the salary of a tube driver, and I think he's pretty happy for it.
Very good. So there was a question we had was, where do you consider there is clean air?
Good question. I think it's probably less about where I consider and more where it's been measured. I can find out, but I don't know. I mean, probably in the few mountainous, secluded areas of Europe, there's some clean air, but most of the places that are inhabited and that have petrol and diesel vehicles or major infrastructure projects are polluted above what the World Health Organization considers safe for us to be breathing. I heard Bhutan has some clean air, but that's a very drastic change.
It's quite niche, I'm afraid, going to Bhutan.
Yeah.
A last question, I think, is a great one from Jane. Are there other presentations that Client Earth has that we should be pointing people towards?
Interesting. So,
You don't need to
sorry,
answer that now. If you want to send that to Jane and myself, we will put it out on the newsletter.
yeah, kind of like you mean more information, some
Yes,
like
and
more
yeah,
papers and updates that people could read.
I think particularly anything that looks good on YouTube that we can point them to.
Yeah.
Those sorts of
Okay.
things.
That's
Yeah,
that's what I meant. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes.
Things
Yeah.
that people can sort of get that bit of, yeah, I want to be part of that feeling
Yeah.
and
Yeah. Okay.
get
Great.
as you do. But I'm
I'll
really
share the
taking
YouTube channel.
yeah, but I'm really taking away your big message that we can offer dosh, but we can also offer airtime, and airtime is probably the thing that really connects you out to the broader society that will, if you like, be your supporters ultimately.
Yeah. And I should
Yeah.
have mentioned as well in that newsletter that I put in there, if you sign up, there's occasionally kind of requests to write to your MP as well, kind of more similar stuff that you'd see from Greenpeace or WWF, but we'll harness that in conjunction with legal advocacy or a legal case. So having signatures towards that is always really helpful as well. And that's one of the more tangible, obvious ways that you can use your voice. But yeah,
Mm.
I mean, what I seem to be learning more and more is that you never know what the impact of using your voice is going to be, but it can be astounding. So it's worth a try.
Okay. I think it's just a fantastic message, and we're speak up for our planet. So message about using all our individual voices to collective good. And
Yeah.
it's, I'm speaking for myself, and it was terribly easy to not do that bit. But that's the time. So I'd like to say a massive thank you very much, Seb. We really appreciate that. And I'd like to invite everyone to give a big round of applause, because that was
Thank you.
absolutely great and very, very inspiring.